The biting autumn wind in Berlin whispered a song of exclusion that Amira knew by heart. Each gust seemed to push her further into the city's shadows, to the invisible edge of society, where she and her 5-year-old daughter Layla struggled to survive. Their days were a monotonous cycle of fear and deprivation. The night shelter that housed them was a labyrinth of human despair, with creaking metal beds and the constant smell of cheap disinfectant masking the odor of shattered lives. Amira, with her 28 years burdened like 50, looked at herself in the small, fogged mirror of the communal bathroom and barely recognized the woman who had once been a literature professor in Cairo. Her eyes, once full of light and stories, were now two deep wells of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. It was a weariness of the soul, a weariness of having to explain her existence, of asking permission to simply be. Layla was her only guiding light, a resilient child whose laughter echoed through the dark corridors like a miracle. But even miracles need fuel, and hunger was a constant visitor. That morning, the last of her reserves, a handful of olives and a piece of dry bread, had vanished. Layla's stomach would rumble later, a sound that, to Amira, was more heartbreaking than any insult. With Layla sleeping on her share of thin mattress, Amira decided to face the day. The light rain that fell was no longer an obstacle. It was part of the landscape of her life. She needed to get to the shelter before 9 to secure a place in line for food assistance. The clock in the nearby church showed 8:15. She wrapped Layla in her warmest coat, a gift from a social worker the previous month, and set out for the daily battle. The streets of Berlin, with their impersonal efficiency and ordered beauty, always made her feel smaller, a disorganized stain in a perfect picture. She walked quickly, head down, avoiding eye contact. Each person who passed by, enveloped in their expensive coats and urgent lives, was a reminder of a world to which she no longer belonged. Layla, innocent, pointed to colorful shop windows, her childlike arabesque mingling with the German that Amira still barely understood. "Mom, look at the doll. Does she have hair like mine?" Amira smiled, a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, Habibti, she does." But what she saw wasn't the doll, but the price tag below it. It was the equivalent of a week's worth of food. The pain of not being able to provide even the slightest bit of beauty for her daughter was a knife twisting in her chest. She held Layla's small, warm hand tighter, as if it were her only anchor in a stormy sea. The shelter was in a renovated basement, and the air inside was heavy, a mixture of sweat, wet clothes and withered hope. The line already snaked down the hallway. Amira found her place at the back, her body already bowing under the weight of anticipated defeat. She looked at the other faces around her, men with empty stares, women with restless children, all united by the same thread of despair. She felt a warm shame rise up her neck. She remembered her classrooms in Cairo, the respect she had commanded, the life she had built. All reduced to this, a number in a queue, a shadow waiting for a crumb of dignity. It was then, while waiting, that her eyes fixed on a poster pasted on a news bulletin board. The image of a smiling man in an impeccable suit, under the title, Alexander Brandt, the philanthropist behind the New Germany. He looked young, perhaps in his 40s, with an intense and confident gaze. Something in that photo, in that promise of generosity, caused a thread of hope, as thin as a hair, to ignite within her. Perhaps there was goodness in this world, perhaps not all were lost. She didn't know it, but that face, that name, would soon become the center of her universe, a presence that would both save her and imprison her in a way she could never have imagined. The rain intensified, turning into a thick, cold curtain that soaked Berlin and drove most people indoors to heated cafes. Amira, however, didn't have that luxury. The line at the shelter moved with agonizing slowness, and when it was finally her turn, the assistant, with a tired face and a monotonous voice, informed her that the food vouchers for the week had run out. There were only a few packets of instant noodles left, and she had managed to get one. The feeling of failure was as physical as a punch to the stomach. She clutched the plastic packet as if it were a meager treasure, which it was. Layla was beginning to get restless and complain of being cold. Her small fingers were pale and wrinkled from the dampness. Amira decided to seek shelter at a nearby bus stop, a glass cubicle that offered some protection from the elements, but none from the indifferent gaze of those passing by in heated cars. It was then, in the precarious refuge of that bus stop, that she saw him. A man, perhaps in his 60s, wearing an expensive coat that was now soaked, stood on the sidewalk across the street, clearly disoriented. He gripped a leather briefcase tightly, but his hands trembled violently. His face was pale, and he was breathing heavily, leaning against a lamppost as if, without it, he would collapse. People passed by him, umbrellas lowered, gazes fixed ahead, ignoring the stranger's evident anguish. It was the urban dance of indifference, and Amira knew it well. She felt an initial impulse to do the same. To look the other way, to protect herself and Layla. The world hadn't been kind to her. Why should she be? But then she looked at the man's face. It wasn't the face of a powerful man or someone indifferent. It was the face of suffering, a suffering she deeply recognized. And in his eyes, there was a silent panic that spoke of loneliness. "Mom, is that gentleman sick?" Layla whispered, her childlike instinct for compassion still pure and intact. That simple question was the final push. Amira stood up. "Stay here, Habibti. Just a minute." She approached the man hesitantly. "Sir? Is everything all right? Do you need help?" The man could barely focus on her. He mumbled something in German, broken words she couldn't understand. But she understood the sweat on his forehead, the labored breathing. It was a heart attack or something like that. Fear chilled her blood. She didn't have a phone. Almost no one in the nursing home did. She looked around desperately. A cozy cafe across the street emanated a golden light. Without thinking twice, Amira put the man's arm over her shoulders, supporting his weight. He was heavy, and she felt her own weak muscles burn with the effort. "Come on, let's take him somewhere dry," she said, in English mixed with Arabic, knowing he wouldn't understand, but hoping the tone of her voice would calm him. With slow, trembling steps, she dragged him across the street, ignoring the angry honking of a car. The cafe door opened with a bell. The warm air, smelling of fresh coffee and cinnamon, was a shock to her senses. All eyes turned to them, the ragged refugee and the obviously wealthy and ill man. The silence was awkward. Amira ignored the stares. She helped him sit on a stool near the door, and then turned to the barista, a young man with a beard and a skeptical expression. "Please help. He's very ill. Call an ambulance, please," she pleaded in her broken English. The barista, initially hesitant, picked up the phone after looking at the man's condition. Amira stood beside him, holding his trembling hand, rubbing it to generate warmth. She took a paper napkin, moistened it with a little water from a glass on the table, and placed it on the man's forehead. He looked at her, and for a brief instant, the panic in his eyes gave way to a spark of deep, immense gratitude. He tried to speak, but couldn't. The ambulance arrived minutes later, its blue lights painting the walls of the cafe. As the paramedics took him away, one of them turned to Amira. "Did you come with him?" She shook her head. "No. I just found him." The paramedic nodded. "You probably saved his life." And then, they were gone. The cafe returned to normal, but the barista, with a slightly less harsh expression, offered Amira a hot coffee. She declined with a nod. Her mission was accomplished. She returned to the bus stop, where Layla awaited her, her eyes wide with admiration. "You helped him, Mom. You're a hero." Amira hugged her daughter, feeling a spark of warmth in her chest that the coffee couldn't have provided. She had done the right thing. In that moment, under the relentless rain, that was all that mattered. She didn't know the man's name. She expected nothing in return. Kindness, she realized, was a refuge in itself, perhaps the only one that no one could take from her. The night in the shelter was particularly noisy. The creaking of the metal bed seemed louder, the coughing and grumbling of the other residents more intrusive. Amira lay on her back, staring at the low ceiling where shadows danced in the light of a street lamp outside. The packet of instant noodles she had shared with Layla for Jannar felt like a cruel joke on her empty stomach. The image of the man in the cafe, his pale face, his trembling hand, wouldn't leave her mind. She wondered if he was all right, if he had survived. The paramedic's statement, "You probably saved his life," echoed in her ears like a distant, strange melody. Saving a life. It was such a grand, heroic concept that it contrasted violently with the reality of her own existence, where she felt powerless to save even herself and her own daughter from hunger and despair. Layla slept beside her, her quiet, regular breathing a balm to her tormented mother's soul. The girl had drawn, with a crayon she had received, a picture of the two of them and a good man on the ground, whom Amira presumed to be the man they had helped. The innocence of that perception broke her heart. For Layla, the world was still a place where you help people and they were okay. Amira wished she could believe in the same simplicity. Fear, however, was a constant companion. What if the man had died? What if she had done something wrong? Could the authorities blame her? Could the police come and get her? The life of a refugee was a fragile web of precarious permissions, and any incident, even an act of kindness, could undo everything. She turned to her side, facing the concrete wall. The smell of the shelter, sweat, chlorine and boredom, permeated her clothes, her skin, her being. She felt a wave of longing so overwhelming that she held her breath. She missed the scent of jasmine in her Cairo garden, the sound of the call to prayer at dusk, the taste of her mother's mint tea. All of that was lost, perhaps forever, buried under the rubble of a conflict she didn't even fully understand. She was a rootless woman, a soul adrift without an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The act of kindness that afternoon felt for a moment like a desperate attempt to anchor herself, to prove to herself that she was still human, that she still possessed agency in a world that systematically stripped her of it. But now, in the solitude of the night, doubt assailed her. Perhaps it was just a foolish gesture, a drop of kindness in an ocean of indifference that wouldn't make the slightest difference. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on Layla's breathing. It was her safe haven, her reason for getting up every morning. Tomorrow would be another day of struggle. Another day of cues, of disdainful glances, of silent battles against hunger and cold. She hadn't expected the man from the cafe, or anyone, to show up. The world didn't work that way for people like her. Stories of miraculous turnarounds were for other people, in distant lands, not for an Egyptian single mother struggling to survive in the grim suburbs of Berlin. The sound of rain beating against the basement window was a monotonous and depressing rhythm. Amira finally fell asleep, her exhausted body overcoming her anxious mind. Her dreams were a confused tapestry of memories of the past and fears of the future, with the man's pale face appearing like a silent ghost. She didn't know that, while she slept, forces were at work. The man she had helped was no nobody. And that simple act of humanity was about to unleash a series of events that would shake the foundations of her reality, pulling her from a desperate existence of anonymity into the spotlight of a man whose desire for control was as great as his wealth. Her kindness had not been a foolish gesture, but a seed. And she was about to discover that some seeds, when nurtured by power, can grow into twisted and unexpected trees. The following morning dawned cold and foggy, the gray Berlin sky reflecting the somber mood inside the shelter. Amira woke with aching body, and a mind clouded by the night's restless dreams. The morning ritual was always the same, helping Layla get dressed in the least wrinkled clothes, making the bed with almost obsessive precision, a last vestige of dignity, and joining the line for breakfast, which consisted of a stale roll and a cup of a watery, brown liquid that was said to be coffee. Layla, however, seemed cheerful. "Mom, maybe the good man will bring us a present today," she said, her voice full of a hope that broke Amira's heart. "No, Habibti," Amira replied softly, running her hand through the girl's curly hair. "We didn't help him for presents. We helped because it was the right thing to do. Men like that, they live in a different world. They don't remember people like us." They were sitting on their bunks, finishing their coffee, when the atmosphere in the shelter suddenly changed. A murmur swept through the large room, followed by an unusual silence. Mrs. Hoffman, the shelter administrator, a stern woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, entered the main room. And she wasn't alone. Behind her were two men. One was tall and imposing, wearing an expensive dark gray overcoat, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mixture of curiosity and disguised revulsion. The other was the man Amira had helped in the rain. He looked pale but well, dressed in an elegant suit and wearing a fine wool coat. He walked with a slower gait, leaning on an elegant cane. All eyes were fixed on them. Who were these men? Why were they there? Just another routine check? More bureaucracy? Amira felt a chill run down her spine. She lowered her head, hoping to go unnoticed. Mrs. Hoffman spoke something quickly in German to the older man, who nodded. Then, to everyone's surprise, they began walking directly toward Amira's corner. The sound of her expensive shoes echoing on the concrete floor seemed extremely loud. Amira froze, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She instinctively pulled Layla closer. They stopped a few meters apart. The man she had helped looked directly at her, and his eyes, now clear and focused, lit up with immediate recognition. A gentle but tired smile appeared on his face. He said something in German, his voice soft and polite. Mrs. Hoffman, with an expression that was a bizarre mixture of irritation and deference, turned to Amira. Amira Al-Said? Herr Vogel would like to speak with you. Amira could barely breathe. 星号 Vogel 星号. Was that the man's name? She didn't understand. The older man, Herr Vogel, extended his hand. In his palm, he held a small crumpled paper napkin, the same one she had used to wipe her forehead at the cafe. He spoke again, and this time Mrs. Hoffman translated, her voice containing a thread of disbelief. He says that you saved his life yesterday. That you are an angel he sent. The shelter was so silent that one could hear the panting breaths of the other people. Amira felt her face grow hot. She didn't know what to say. She just shook her head shyly. It was then that Layla bravely stepped out from behind her mother. Are you the good man from the ground? She asked in Arabic. Herr Vogel looked at the girl, and his smile widened. He bent down with some difficulty, leaning on his cane, until he was at her eye level. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her intention. He nodded yes. Then he raised his eyes to Amira again, and his gaze was intense, penetrating. He spoke a few more sentences, and Mrs. Hoffman, now clearly impressed, translated. Mr. Vogel is a very, very influential man in Berlin. He insists that you and your daughter can no longer stay in this place. He's here to take you away. He's offering you a place to stay. Amira felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She looked at the man's face, into his eyes that conveyed gratitude, but also something more, a fierce, almost possessive determination. Was this real? Was it a dream? A trick? The kindness she had shown, that simple, selfless act, had indeed returned to her the next day, but in such an overwhelming, grand way that it seemed dangerous. She was about to exchange the familiar misery of the shelter for absolute uncertainty. And in the eyes of that influential man, she saw not only a savior, but someone who, perhaps, would never accept no for an answer. The car that took them from the shelter was a silent, opulent limousine, with a fragrant leather interior and tinted windows that completely isolated them from the outside world. Amira and Layla sat side by side, their simple, worn clothes seeming an insult to the immaculate luxury around them. Amira felt like a character in a movie, disconnected from reality. She held Layla's hand with a force that made her knuckles turn white. Herr Vogel, whose full name was Klaus Vogel, sat in the front, next to the driver, the imposing man from the shelter who was his personal assistant, Stefan. Klaus spoke softly on the phone, giving orders in a tone that admitted no contestation. He occasionally turned and smiled at them, a smile that was supposedly reassuring, but which to Amira seemed calculated, like part of a script she hadn't been given. They hadn't gone to a hotel. The car entered an elegant and quiet neighborhood of Charlottenburg and stopped in front of an imposing old house, restored with impeccable taste. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and dark wood, a statement of power and wealth. The door was opened by a housekeeper in an immaculate uniform, who greeted them with a formal nod. Willkommen in Ihrem neuen Zuhause, Shesaid. 星号 welcome to your new home 星号. The phrase echoed in Amira's mind like a sentence. The interior was even more impressive. Everything was spacious, minimalist, and coldly beautiful. The walls were white. The polished marble floor reflected the cool light of the designer fixtures. There were few personal objects, only expensive abstract art pieces that seemed to watch over the rooms indifferently. They were shown an ensuite bedroom, a room larger than all the space they had occupied in the last 2 years. There was a large, soft bed, an ensuite bathroom with gleaming tiles and a bathtub, and a view of a carefully planned inner garden. For Layla, it was a fairy tale castle. She ran and threw herself onto the bed, laughing. "Mom, look! It's soft! And it doesn't creak." Amira forced a smile. She was stunned. The generosity was overwhelming. Klaus left them to settle in, saying they would have dinner together later to discuss the future. When the bedroom door closed, Amira leaned against it, feeling trapped. This wasn't a refuge, it was a transaction. She had saved his life, and now he was buying his debt of gratitude. The precarious freedom of the shelter had been replaced by an oppressive dependence. She was a guest, yes, but a guest who couldn't leave. Dinner was a surreal experience. Served on a solid wood dining table that could seat 20 people, the food was a culinary work of art, each dish an explosion of flavors that her palate, accustomed to stale bread and watery soup, could barely process. Klaus asked about her life, about Egypt, about how they had arrived in Germany. His questions were insightful, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her uncomfortable. He wasn't just listening, he was gathering data, studying her. He then revealed his plan. He didn't just want them to stay there temporarily. He wanted to sponsor them. He would provide a German tutor, residency papers, a place at a good school for Layla. "You gave me a second chance at life, Amira," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "Let me return the favor. Let me give you and Layla the life you deserve." The words were perfect, but they sounded like an ultimatum. What would happen if she said no? Where would they go? Back to the shelter, under Mrs. Hoffman's disdainful gaze? She was entangled. His kindness was a silken web, soft and shimmering, but inescapable. She accepted with a silent nod, feeling not like a rescued survivor, but like a rare piece that had been acquired and placed in a display case. The cage was golden, but it was a cage nonetheless. And she began to realize that Klaus Vogel's desires went far beyond simple retribution. The following weeks were a whirlwind of new routes and alien comforts. A German tutor, the stern Frau Weber, arrived every day to give intensive lessons to Amira and Layla. Their old clothes were replaced by a wardrobe full of designer pieces, chosen by a personal shopper who didn't seem to notice Amira's palpable discomfort. Layla was enrolled in a private and exclusive kindergarten, where the other children spoke impeccable German and wore expensive uniforms. The girl blossomed, her happiness was evident, and that was the only thing keeping Amira sane. But with each passing day, the outlines of her new prison became clearer. Klaus wasn't just a distant benefactor. He was a constant presence. He wanted to dine with them every night, demanding detailed accounts of their days. His gifts were frequent and expensive: a fine jewel, a state-of-the-art tablet for Layla, luxurious editions of Arabic books for Amira. Each gift was another link in the chain, a silent reminder of the debt she supposedly owed. He began making small comments about how she should style her hair, about which colors suited her best, about the importance of integrating completely, which, Amira realized, meant erasing any outward trace of her Egyptian heritage. One afternoon, he gently reprimanded her for speaking Arabic with Layla in front of him. "She needs to focus on German now, Amira. It's for her future, don't you think?" The voice was soft, but the order was clear. She felt like a doll being dressed and positioned for her owner's pleasure. Her past, her struggles, her identity, everything was being systematically erased and replaced with a version that Klaus considered acceptable. He began talking about long-term plans, about getting her an administrative position in one of his companies, something easy, to keep you busy, about buying an apartment for them, but of course, close by, so I can take care of you. The word care sounded more and more like control. The trap was closing in. The gratitude she had initially felt had transformed into constant anxiety. She was a prisoner of his kindness, his suffocating generosity. She couldn't complain. To the outside world, she was the lucky refugee saved by a saint. Who would believe she felt suffocated by so much luxury? One night, after Layla went to bed, Klaus summoned her to his office. It was an intimidating room, with walls lined with books and a large steel desk. He stood near the window, looking out at the illuminated city. "You know, Amira," he began, without turning around, I built an empire with my own strength. I have everything a man could want. But what happened to me that day, it showed me what's missing." He turned and his gaze was intense, vulnerable, but also demanding. "What's missing is a genuine connection. Someone who isn't with me for my money or influence. Someone like you." He took a step toward her. "I want you and Layla to become my family." It wasn't a request. It was a declaration. Amira felt a chill run through her veins. He wasn't just offering shelter, he was claiming ownership. Kindness had turned into desire, and his desire was a cage from which she saw no escape. She was trapped not by force, but by debt, guilt, and the fear of losing the security he provided Layla. That act of kindness in the rain had plowed the path to a gilded servitude. Klaus's statement echoed in Amira's mind like a gong, shaking the foundations of her already fragile reality. "My family." The words were a thin veil over a deep and disturbing demand. She was no longer a recipient of his charity. She had been promoted to an object of his affection, a component in his vision of a perfect, controlled life. The following days transformed into a suffocating pantomime. Every meal, every conversation, was staged under Klaus's watchful gaze. His gifts became more personal, more intimate. An expensive French perfume, a silk scarf he hinted matched her eyes. He began to touch her arm more often, to adjust a stray hair, gestures meant to be affectionate, but which made her shrink inside. The house, with its clean lines and oppressive silence, felt more than ever like a high-security prison. The only time she felt a glimpse of freedom was in the mornings, when she took Layla to school. It was a short walk, but it was the only time she wasn't under the direct observation of Klaus or her governess. She breathed deeply the cool morning air, feeling it clear some of the fog of despair that had settled in her mind. It was during one of these walks that she saw something that made her heart race. In a small square near the school, there was an open-air market. Colorful stalls sold fruits, vegetables, and spices. And in one of those stalls, she saw a familiar face. It was an older woman, with Middle Eastern features, wearing a colorful hijab. She was negotiating with the vendor in Arabic with an Egyptian accent. The sound of her mother tongue, so rarely heard now, hit Amira like a wave of heat. Without thinking, she approached. The woman noticed her hesitation and smiled. "Alan, ya bent."
"Xinghao, hello, my daughter Xinghao."
The simple greeting was so powerful that Amira's eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard and replied in Arabic. "Alan." The woman introduced herself as Sanaa, a Syrian who had lived in Berlin for 10 years. She had a small spice shop not far from there. The conversation was brief, but it was the first genuine, unsupervised interaction Amira had had in weeks. Sanaa seemed to sense the anguish behind Amira's eyes. She didn't ask questions, just said, "My shop is on Oranian Street, number 42. The door is always open to anyone who needs a piece of home." The walk back to Klaus's house was bittersweet. That brief encounter was a ray of light, a reminder that there was a world out there, a world of real people with real struggles, not this controlled fantasy she was trapped in. She looked at the imposing facade of the house and felt a wave of claustrophobia. She couldn't go on like this. She was trading her daughter's soul, and her own, for material security. Layla was already beginning to forget Arabic, already getting used to a life of empty privileges. Amira entered the house with a new determination fermenting in her chest. Klaus was waiting for her in the living room. "You're late," he said, his voice soft but with a steely edge. "I was worried." He wasn't worried, he was checking. That night, Amira couldn't sleep. She looked at Layla, sleeping peacefully in the soft bed, and knew that what she had to do wasn't just for herself, but for her daughter. She couldn't let Layla grow up believing that this was the way to live, like a bird in a cage, singing to please its owner. Klaus's desire wasn't for a partner, it was for possession. And she refused to be possessed. The whisper of freedom, initiated by the kindness of a stranger at the market, was becoming a scream within her. She had to find a way to escape the gilded cage, not back to the despair of the shelter, but toward a life truly her own, however difficult it might be. The plan formed in Amira's mind with the stark clarity of desperation. She had no money, her documents were still with Klaus, he'd insisted on keeping them safe, and she knew no one in Berlin except Sanaa. But Sanaa's shop was her only beacon. She spent the next few days in a state of controlled anxiety, gathering what she could. She hid some of Layla's non-perishable snacks in her old backpack. She took a simple coat and a pair of sneakers, swapping them for the designer clothes in her closet, hoping the housekeeper wouldn't notice. She acted with a calmness that surprised her, her face a mask of resigned gratitude whenever Klaus was around. The hardest part was Layla. "Habibti," she whispered one night, lying beside her daughter on the big bed. "Tomorrow we're going to play adventure. A very serious adventure. You need to be very brave and quiet, like a spy, understand?" Layla, her eyes wide with excitement, nodded earnestly. Amira felt a pang of guilt for involving her daughter in this, but there was no choice. The opportunity came on a Wednesday morning. Klaus had an early meeting in another district, and had left before they woke up. The housekeeper had the day off. The house was strangely empty and silent. It was now or never. Her heart pounding so hard she feared it could be heard. Amira dressed Layla in simple clothes, grabbed her hidden backpack, and left the suite. They descended the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps sounding like a gunshot. The front door seemed like a mountain to climb. She placed her hand on the heavy doorknob, turned it and pushed. The door opened to the pale morning light. The open air had never smelled so sweet. Without looking back, she picked Layla up and began to walk, first at a normal pace, then faster, until they were almost running towards the market square. She didn't know if there were alarms, if Stefan, the assistant, would suddenly appear. Every sound of an approaching car made her flinch. They arrived at the square. Sanaa's stall wasn't there. It was a different market day. Panic began to rise in her throat. Then she remembered the address. 42 Orani N Street. She asked a flower seller, using her hesitant German. He pointed to a side street. She ran, with Layla panting in her arms. And then she saw it. A small shop with a green facade, the name, Flavors of Apricot, written in Arabic and German. She went inside, making the doorbell jingle. The interior was small, cramped, and smelled wonderfully of cardamom, cinnamon, and cumin. Sanaa was behind the counter, arranging bags of spices. She looked up, and her initially neutral face broke into an expression of surprise at seeing Amira, pale and breathless, with a child in her arms and the wild look of a person cornered. "Ya Allah, my daughter! What happened?" Amira could barely speak. The words came out in a torrent of Arabic and tears. She spoke of Klaus, of the golden cage, of his desire to possess them. Sanaa listened, her face turning serious. She came around the counter and locked the shop door, flipping the sign to "closed." She led Amira to a small back room where there was a teapot and 2 chairs. "You're safe here," Sanaa said firmly. "No one will hurt you." For the first time in weeks, Amira felt it was true. She wasn't safe because of thick walls or alarm systems, but because she had found a kindred spirit. She cried, sobbing with relief and retroactive fear, while Layla, confused but brave, snuggled into her lap. Sanaa didn't ask many questions. She offered Layla tea, bread and hummus and picked up the phone. "I know people," she said simply. "People who help women like you. Not refugees from the system, but refugees from men." The escape was terrifying, but in that small spice shop, amidst the smells of home and the silent solidarity of a woman who understood, Amira felt the first real glimmer of hope. She hadn't escaped into despair. She had escaped into the possibility of an authentic life. And she vowed to herself that, no matter how hard it was, she would never again trade her freedom for any kind of comfort. The days following the escape were a mixture of fear and exhausting liberation. Sanaa, with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew the ins and outs of immigrant life, led Amira and Layla to an underground support network for women. They were taken to a safe haven, unlike the overcrowded state shelter. It was a modest but clean and cozy apartment, shared with 3 other women and their children, all fleeing abusive situations. For the first time, Amira didn't feel judged. They were all the same, united by stories of survival. One of them, an Iranian lawyer named Nasreen, offered to help her with her documents. Another, a Polish woman named Eva, who worked as a hairdresser, cut Amira's hair for free, giving her a new look that made her feel renewed. Amira felt enveloped by a sisterhood that Klaus, with all his wealth, could never have bought. She got a part-time job, helping Sanaa at the spice shop. The work was physical, weighing, packing, cleaning, but it was honest. She was paid in cash, a modest salary, but it was hers. The sound of the coins in her hand had a meaning that no credit card provided by Klaus could have. She rented a small room for herself and Layla in the shared apartment. It was tiny, with a window overlooking an inner courtyard, but it was theirs. The door didn't have locks controlled by someone else. Layla, after an initial period of confusion, adapted. She started speaking Arabic with her mother again, and made friends with the other children in the apartment. Her laughter echoed through the hallways again. But now it was genuine laughter, not dampened by the subtle fear of displeasing a benefactor. Amira enrolled her in a diverse and welcoming local public school, where she was just another child, not a philanthropist's protege. Life was hard, uncertain, but it was real. However, Klaus's shadow loomed over them. Amira lived in constant fear of being found. She avoided the upscale neighborhoods, changed her route to school and work. She knew a man with his resources wouldn't give up easily. Her escape had been a blow to his ego, to his savior narrative. About 3 weeks after her escape, the dreaded happened. While Amira was arranging spices in the window of Sanaa's shop, a familiar black car pulled up in front. Her heart stopped. Stefan, the assistant, got out of the car, followed by Klaus. He looked older, his features marked by a contained rage. They entered the shop. The ringing of the doorbell sounded like an alarm. Sanaa immediately emerged from behind the counter, positioning herself between them and Amira, who had retreated to the back of the shop, trembling. "Frau Al-Sayed," Klaus said, his voice soft as velvet, but his eyes were icy. "You've caused us so much worry. Is Layla all right?" Amira felt a hot fury replace her fear. He had no right to ask about her daughter. "We're fine, Herr Vogel. Thank you for your hospitality. But we don't need it anymore." Klaus gave a tense smile. "I think there's a misunderstanding. I only want what's best for you. This place," he looked around the modest shop with clear disdain, "isn't suitable for Layla. Don't you think it's selfish to deprive her of all the opportunities one could offer?" It was the wrong move. Amira straightened her shoulders, feeling a strength she didn't know she possessed. "What's selfish, Herr Vogel, is trying to buy a family. What's selfish is trying to erase who we are. Layla doesn't need your wealth. She needs a mother who is free. And that's what I am now. Please go away." The silence in the shop was heavy. Klaus stared at her, and for the first time, he seemed to perceive her not as a possession, but as a person, a woman with an unwavering will. He saw the determination in her eyes, the support network around her in Sanaa's protective figure. He realized he couldn't defeat her, not that way. Without a word, he turned and left, followed by Stefan. The black car drove away. Amira broke down in tears, but this time, they were tears of victory. She had faced the dragon and won. The shadow hadn't completely disappeared, but she knew she had the power to live outside of it. She had regained not only her freedom, but her voice. A year had passed. The seasons had turned, and Berlin's harsh winter had given way to a timid spring, with stubborn green buds sprouting in the gardens of public parks. Amira and Layla still lived in their shared apartment, but their lives had transformed in profound and lasting ways. Amira no longer worked solely for Sanaa. Her fluency in German, acquired with sweat and tears in night classes sponsored by a women's charity, had improved dramatically. Combined with her fluent English and Arabic, she had secured a stable job as an administrative assistant at a multicultural community center. The salary was modest, but enough to cover her expenses and allow for small luxuries, like buying a new book for Layla or going to the movies. She had her own bank account, her own rental agreement. She was, finally, a citizen of her own life. Layla flourished at school. She was a natural bridge between cultures, helping other newly arrived children adapt. At home, the lingua franca was a cheerful mix of Arabic and German, a tapestry of her dual identity that Amira nurtured with pride. She never saw or heard from Klaus Vogel again. His shadow had dissipated, replaced by the bright light of her own autonomy. One Saturday afternoon, Amira was in the park with Layla. They had a simple picnic: bread, cheese, olives, and a handful of dates that reminded Amira of home. The sun was warm on their faces, and the sound of children playing filled the air. Layla ran off to join a game of football with other children, her laughter echoing freely. Amira watched, her heart overflowing with a peace that went beyond happiness. It was a feeling of completeness, of having successfully navigated the most treacherous waters and anchored in a safe harbor of her own making. She looked at her hands, hands that had held the trembling hand of a stranger in the rain, that had packed spices, that had filled out bureaucratic forms, that had stroked the forehead of her sleeping daughter. They told the story of her journey. The kindness she had shown on that rainy day hadn't held her captive forever. Instead, it had been the catalyst that forced her to find her own strength. She was no longer the desperate refugee, nor the coveted possession of a powerful man. She was Amira al-Sayed, survivor, mother, worker, and finally free. The positive turnaround didn't come from a stranger's wealth, but from the rediscovery of her own power. The emotional surprise wasn't a wrapped gift, but the daily realization that she was capable of building a good and meaningful life, with her own hands and with the help of her true community. The initial kindness planted a seed, but it was her courage and resilience that allowed it to flourish. And in that park, under the Berlin spring sun, surrounded by the life she had created for herself, Amira knew that the most satisfying ending was not a rescue, but the achievement of her own freedom.